I turned 69 on a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary weekday that usually slips past unnoticed unless someone gives it meaning. That morning, I woke before dawn, the house still wrapped in darkness, the air cool and faintly scented with the cedar beams that had aged alongside me. For a few moments, I lay there listening to the soft hum of the heating system and the distant whisper of wind brushing against the tall trees outside. This house had always sounded alive to me, full of subtle confirmations that I was not alone in the world. But that morning, there was something hollow in the quiet, something unfinished. I reached for my phone on the bedside table, not because it vibrated, not because it lit up with notifications, but because habit pulled my hand there before reason could intervene. The screen was blank. No messages, no missed calls. I told myself it was early. I told myself people had jobs, meetings, responsibilities. I told myself not to read into silence. I had become very good at telling myself things over the years. I moved through my morning slowly, deliberately, as if stretching time might allow something to arrive inside it. I brewed coffee the way Anna used to like it, strong enough to wake the dead, and poured it into the blue ceramic mug she'd bought on a weekend trip decades ago. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky shift from charcoal to pale gray, remembering how she used to stand beside me, her shoulder pressed lightly against my arm, commenting on the weather as if it were a conversation partner. After she died, I learned that grief does not announce itself loudly every day. Sometimes it arrives disguised as routine, as memory folded into muscle and bone. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat in the leather chair she used to tease me about, the one she said made me look like a man who never laughed. I laughed plenty when she was alive. I just hadn't found much reason since. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked time with a steady, patient rhythm. Tick, tock. Each sound felt heavier than the last, as though the clock itself were counting something more than seconds. 69 years, a lifetime of decisions. A lifetime of building something solid from nothing. I had started with a dusty workshop, a single employee, and an idea no one else believed in. I had worked until my hands ached and my back screamed, until success became less of a dream and more of a burden I carried quietly. I did it all for my family. For Anna, for Leo. When Anna was gone, I doubled down on that promise. Everything I did afterward was an attempt to shield my son from the sharp edges of the world. I thought love meant removing obstacles. I thought protection was the same as preparation. I was wrong. But that realization would come later. By mid-morning, I had checked my phone more times than I cared to admit. Still, nothing. I told myself not to be childish. I reminded myself that I was a grown man, that birthdays were arbitrary markers, that validation should not come from a glowing screen. And yet, some part of me kept listening for that sound, the gentle buzz that would say, "You matter. You are remembered." I went for a walk through the garden, trimming a few branches here and there, touching leaves as if they could anchor me to the present. Anna and I had planted this garden together. Every path, every rosebush carried a story. The garden had outlasted her, outlasted so many things. I wondered, not for the first time, what would outlast me. Afternoon came and went. The sun shifted across the floor, drawing long shadows that crept slowly up the walls. I ate lunch alone at the long dining table, sitting at the same seat I always did, the one across from where Anna used to sit. There was a time when this table echoed with conversation, with laughter, with Leo's childhood complaints and questions. Now it felt like a museum exhibit, preserved, untouched, quietly irrelevant. I told myself again that Leo was busy, that Chloe probably had plans. I had watched their lives from a distance for years, had written checks instead of asking questions, had paid for things because it was easier than confronting what I sensed was missing. I had mistaken generosity for connection. I had confused provision with presence. As evening settled in, the silence changed. It thickened. It became something I could feel pressing against my chest. The lights inside the house cast warm pools of gold, but they did nothing to chase away the emptiness that seemed to seep into every corner. I picked up my phone again, turning it over in my hand, debating with myself like a man standing at the edge of a cold lake. I didn't want to sound needy. I didn't want to seem like an old man begging for attention, but I also didn't want to let the day end without at least trying. So I typed a message. I erased it. I typed another. I erased that too. In the end, I chose simplicity. Something honest. Something harmless. A father's words, not a demand. I read it twice, then a third time, and before doubt could stop me, I hit send. For a brief moment, relief washed over me. The message was gone. The ball was no longer in my court. I leaned back in my chair and waited, convincing myself that whatever happened next would be enough. Less than a minute later, my phone vibrated. Hope surged through me so quickly it almost hurt. My heart lifted. My shoulders loosened. I smiled without realizing it. I picked up the phone, expecting warmth, expecting something familiar. What I saw instead froze me in place. 2 sentences. That was all it took. 2 sentences delivered with the emotional weight of a termination notice. "We need space from you. Please don't reach out anymore at all." I read it once, my mind refusing to register the meaning. I read it again, slower this time, as if clarity might soften the blow. It didn't. The words felt clinical, rehearsed, devoid of emotion. This wasn't frustration. This wasn't confusion. This was a decision. A clean cut. My chest tightened, my breath catching as though the air had been knocked from my lungs. I stared at the screen, waiting for some clarification to appear, some follow-up that would explain this cruelty. Instead, my eyes dropped lower. A small icon sat beneath the message, a red heart, and next to it, a name. Chloe liked this message. That was the moment something fundamental shifted inside me. The pain didn't explode. It didn't scream. It settled. It hardened. I understood then, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that this was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was unity, agreement, applause. In those 2 sentences and that single heart, I saw the truth I had avoided for years. I was not being pushed away because I was overbearing or intrusive. I was being discarded because I had outlived my usefulness. I wasn't a father in that moment. I was an inconvenience. I set the phone down slowly, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. Around me, the house remained unchanged. The clock continued, its patient ticking. The walls stood firm. The world did not end. But something in me did, and in its place, something else began to form, quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. The era of being taken for granted was over. I didn't move for a long time after that. I sat there with my hands resting on the arms of the chair, my back straight, my eyes unfocused, as if my body had decided that stillness was the safest possible response. I had learned long ago that reacting too quickly, especially to pain, often leads to mistakes you can't undo. The house felt different now, as if it were waiting for me to speak, to rage, to shatter the quiet, the way a younger version of myself might have done. But no sound came. Instead, memories began arriving uninvited, lining up in my mind with a precision that felt almost cruel. Not isolated moments, not random flashes, but a pattern years of small concessions I had made, each one dismissed at the time as harmless, each one now revealing itself as part of a larger surrender. I thought about the first time Leo had spoken to me with impatience instead of respect. He was barely out of college then, standing in my study, hands in his pockets, asking no, telling me that he needed help securing an apartment in the city. He had said it casually, like someone asking for a glass of water. When I hesitated, when I suggested something more modest, he had rolled his eyes and laughed. "Come on, Dad," he'd said. "You know I can't live like a student forever." I remember feeling a faint sting then, a brief internal warning that I silenced almost immediately. I told myself he was young, that ambition sometimes sounded like arrogance, that my job as a father was to smooth the road ahead of him, not to argue about the scenery. I wrote the check and convinced myself it was love. From there, it had escalated slowly. So slowly, I barely noticed the incline. The penthouse they called a starter home. The cars that changed every couple of years. always slightly more expensive than the last. The wedding, my God, the wedding. Chloe had wanted it to be timeless, a word that somehow translated into imported flowers, a venue overlooking the water, and a guest list that included people they barely knew but wanted to impress. I paid for it all without complaint. When friends asked why I didn't set limits, I smiled and said something vague about wanting my son to have what I never did. What I didn't say was that I was afraid that saying no would push him away, afraid that love, once withdrawn, might not come back. Now, sitting alone on my birthday with that text message burned into my mind, I finally understood the cost of that fear. I had raised my son in comfort so complete that discomfort felt like an insult to him. I had removed struggle from his life and replaced it with entitlement. And entitlement, I was learning, has no room for gratitude. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with a deep, sobering clarity, the kind that strips away illusion and leaves only truth behind. I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with a worldview, one where my role had been quietly reduced to a function, a background process that supplied resources but did not require respect. I stood and walked toward the window, looking out over the lawn, the carefully maintained hedges, the long driveway that curved out of sight toward the road. This home had been built brick by brick, decision by decision. Every square foot represented years of effort, of risk, of nights spent wondering if everything would collapse the next morning. I had never resented that work. I had been proud of it, but now I saw that my pride had blinded me. I had assumed that my son understood where all of this came from, that he felt some connection to the effort behind it. The truth was simpler and harsher. To him, it had always just been there. The phone remained on the table behind me, face down, like an object that had completed its purpose. I didn't pick it up again. I didn't reread the message. I didn't need to. Its meaning was already etched into me. What surprised me most was not the pain, but what followed it. Beneath the hurt, beneath the disappointment, something steadier began to rise. A calm I hadn't felt in years. It was the calm of acceptance, not resignation, but recognition. You cannot fix what someone refuses to acknowledge. You cannot negotiate with people who believe they are owed. And you cannot continue supplying a system that feeds on your silence. I poured myself a glass of water and sat back down, this time at the desk in my study. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. This was where decisions had always been made, where contracts had been signed, where strategies had been drawn up when my company faced real threats. I realized then that I had never applied that same discipline to my personal life. I had allowed emotion to override judgment, love to override boundaries. That era ended in that moment, not with anger, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet internal shift. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was deciding. I picked up my phone again, not to call or text, but to scroll. I opened Leo's contact information and stared at it longer than necessary. His name, his photo, all the history contained in a few digital fields. Blocking him felt symbolic, almost ceremonial. It wasn't punishment, it was alignment. They had asked for space. I was finally prepared to give it fully, completely, and on my terms. My finger hovered for only a second before I pressed the button, confirm. Then Chloe's name. The same motion, the same certainty. When it was done, the silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was clean. There was one more call to make. This one didn't require rehearsal or emotional preparation. I had made difficult calls my entire life. This was simply another. David Sterling answered on the second ring, his voice steady and familiar. I told him we needed to meet. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. He knew me well enough to hear the finality in my tone. We agreed on the morning. When I ended the call, I sat back and let the quiet settle around me. For the first time since Anna died, I felt something close to control, not over other people, but over myself. That night, I slept deeply. No tossing, no staring at the ceiling. When I woke, the path ahead felt unmistakably clear. I wasn't driven by revenge. I wasn't interested in proving a point. I was simply done financing my own erasure. Whatever came next would be deliberate, lawful, and irreversible. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath the sadness and the years of compromise, I felt something else stir. Dignity. Reclaimed at last. The drive to David's office the next morning felt unlike any drive I had taken in years. The roads were the same familiar turns, the same stretch of trees lining the highway, but my relationship to them had changed. I wasn't replaying conversations in my head or rehearsing arguments. I wished I'd had the courage to start. My mind was clear, almost eerily so. There is a strange peace that arrives when indecision finally dies. I watched the autumn leaves scatter across the asphalt, their colors dulled by overcast light, and I felt no melancholy in it. Everything decays eventually. The only tragedy is pretending otherwise. David's building rose from the city like a monument, to quiet power, glass, steel, and restraint. No flash, no excess, just permanence. I had chosen him decades earlier for that reason. He wasn't dazzled by money, and he wasn't moved by drama. He understood systems, leverage, and consequence. When his assistant ushered me into his office, he stood from behind his desk and nodded. Once, his expression unreadable but attentive. He didn't ask me how I was. He didn't offer sympathy. He knew better. Some meetings are not about feelings. They are about facts. I told him everything. Not with the rawness of a wounded father, but with the precision of a man documenting a breach of trust. I described the birthday, the silence, the message, the heart beneath it. As I spoke, I watched David's reaction carefully. He didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his eyebrows. He listened the way surgeons do before making an incision, calm, focused, already considering the solution. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and exhaled through his nose, not in surprise, but in confirmation. "I've been expecting this," he said quietly. Those 4 words landed heavier than anything else he could have said. He reminded me of moments I had dismissed or forgotten. The yacht club toast years ago, when Leo had thanked me not as a father, but as an investor. The casual way Chloe referred to trust assets as their money. The pattern had been there, visible to anyone willing to see it. I had chosen not to. Hearing it spoken aloud didn't hurt it, clarified. It told me I wasn't cruel or reactive. I was late. David slid the trust file across the desk. Thick, heavy, final, my name embossed on the cover. The Thorne Family Revocable Trust. For years, I had viewed it as a safety net for my son, a final act of love from beyond the grave. David reminded me of something essential, something I had known intellectually but forgotten emotionally. Revocable meant control. Absolute control. I wasn't dismantling anything that belonged to them. I was reclaiming what had always been mine. I told him exactly what I wanted. No hesitation, no negotiation. Remove them as beneficiaries. End the allowance. Terminate the leases. Cancel the guarantees. Shut down the flow entirely. David nodded once, already outlining the steps in his mind. This wasn't revenge. It was governance. When a system fails, you don't apologize to it. You correct it. As David began drafting the amendments, I felt no triumph, only certainty. Somewhere in Manhattan, Leo and Chloe were still living, as if the ground beneath them were solid. They didn't know the supports were already being removed. They didn't know the world they had taken for granted was about to demand proof of worth instead of accepting a name. I didn't need to witness the collapse. I already understood it. Systems built on entitlement always fail the moment supply is cut. When I left David's office, the city felt smaller, less imposing. Power, I realized, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It operates quietly, through documents and decisions and timing. By the time Leo's cards began to decline, by the time confusion turned into panic, the outcome would already be sealed. There would be no argument to win, no apology sufficient to reverse it. I had finally learned what leadership demanded: clarity, boundaries, and the courage to let consequences teach what love could not. That evening, as I returned home, I stood once more in the garden Anna and I had built together. The roses were still blooming, indifferent to family drama and financial collapse. Nature understands balance instinctively. Give too much water, and roots rot. Give too little, and the plant dies. I had overwatered for years. Now, at last, I had stopped. And for the first time since receiving that message, I didn't feel old. I felt awake. The first signs arrived quietly, exactly as I knew they would. Systems do not collapse all at once. They stutter first. They hesitate. They reveal themselves through small malfunctions that people accustomed to privilege never expect. I didn't need updates, but David provided them anyway. Brief, factual, almost clinical. Credit lines frozen. Automated transfers halted. Lease payments rejected. Each adjustment was clean, legal, and irreversible. By the time the sun set on the second day, the machine that had fueled my son's life for years was already grinding to a halt. I imagined the moment it reached him, the disbelief before the panic. Leo had never experienced financial resistance. Money had always responded to him, the way elevators respond to buttons immediately and without question. I could picture him at a restaurant he liked to frequent, one of those places where the lighting is low and the bill is high enough to discourage curiosity. He would have handed over his card without looking, already planning the rest of his evening. When the waiter returned, apologetic and uncertain, Leo would have laughed it off. Machines make mistakes. Reality does not. But when the second card failed, and then the third, confusion would have set in. Confusion, for someone like Leo, is terrifying. It suggests a world that does not recognize him. I could almost hear his voice rising not in anger yet, but in offense. Chloe would have joined in then, her irritation sharp and impatient, as though inconvenience itself were an insult directed at her personally. They would have assumed the problem was temporary, a glitch, a misunderstanding. It would not have occurred to them that the problem was intentional. By the time they tried to call me, the shift would already be underway. Leo's confidence had always been anchored to my accessibility. He believed that no matter what happened, I would answer. That illusion shattered the moment his call went straight to silence. No ringing, no voicemail greeting, just absence. The same absence he had handed me so casually with 2 sentences the night before. I wondered if he recognized it then. If he felt even a fraction of what I had felt reading his message. Perhaps not. Entitlement dulls empathie. The calls would have escalated quickly. From irritation to confusion. From confusion to alarm. Texts sent with increasing urgency, each one more revealing than the last. When the messages failed to send, when even the illusion of contact collapsed, the panic would have become undeniable. Chloe would have pressed him for answers. Accusations would have flown. Fear has a way of sharpening blame. And through it all, one truth would have slowly emerged. There was no safety net anymore. While their world began to shake, mine grew quieter. I tended to the garden, cooked simple meals, and slept without interruption. The absence of constant anticipation, the expectation that I would be called only when something was needed, was liberating. Silence, I discovered, could be restorative when it was chosen. I wasn't ignoring them out of cruelty. I was honoring their request. Space, after all, was what they wanted. Days passed, then a week. I knew the next phase would arrive soon. Entitlement resists surrender. It scrambles. It searches for leverage. Chloe would have begun liquidating what she could: handbags, jewelry, the visible symbols of a life she believed permanent. Leo, faced with balances he didn't understand and obligations he'd never managed, would have realized for the first time that comfort without competence is fragile, very fragile. The eviction notice would have been the real blow, not because of the paper itself, but because of what it represented. Ownership, they would discover, was never theirs. Everything had been structured through the trust, something they had never bothered to understand because it had always worked in their favor. Seeing their address printed beside the words "Notice to Vacate" would have been sobering in a way no declined card could ever be. It's one thing to lose access to luxury. It's another to lose shelter. And then the car. The tow truck doesn't negotiate. It doesn't explain. It simply executes orders. Watching Chloe's Range Rover lifted from the street would have been a public unraveling, witnessed by neighbors who once smiled politely, unaware of how hollow that life truly was. Status evaporates quickly when it is leased rather than earned. I felt no satisfaction imagining any of it, only inevitability. I hadn't pushed them off a cliff. I had simply stepped aside and let gravity resume its work. The world was doing what I had failed to do for years, introducing my son to consequence. That night, I sat in my study and read until my eyes grew tired. The phone remained silent on the desk. I knew the storm of calls was coming, that desperation would eventually replace arrogance. But for the first time, I understood something essential. Silence was not abandonment. It was boundary. And boundary, I was learning, is sometimes the purest form of love. The calls began the way I expected them to, cautious at first, almost polite. Unknown numbers lighting up my screen, spaced just far enough apart to suggest restraint. Leo was trying to regain control without admitting he'd lost it. I let them ring. Later, I listened to the voicemails, not out of curiosity, but documentation. Years in business had taught me that patterns reveal intent more clearly than words ever could. At first, his tone was measured, professional even, as if he were speaking to a colleague who had misplaced a file. He spoke of errors and miscommunications, of banks and automated systems that must have malfunctioned. He never apologized. He never mentioned the text. Not once did he ask how I was. He assumed, still, that the issue was mechanical, not personal. That assumption alone told me everything I needed to know. Then the calls grew closer together. The pauses disappeared. His voice changed. Irritation crept in, followed quickly by accusation. He wanted answers now. He wanted access restored. He wanted his life back. Chloe's influence was unmistakable in the background. Sharp whispers, sudden bursts of anger, the sound of someone who had never learned how to be powerless. I imagined them pacing their apartment, still filled with expensive furniture but rapidly losing its meaning, as though inconvenience itself were an insult directed at her personally. They would have assumed the problem was temporary, a glitch, a misunderstanding. It would not have occurred to them that the problem was intentional. By the time they tried to call me, the shift would already be underway. Leo's confidence had always been anchored to my accessibility. He believed that no matter what happened, I would answer. That illusion shattered the moment his call went straight to silence. No ringing, no voicemail greeting, just absence. The same absence he had handed me so casually with 2 sentences the night before. I wondered if he recognized it then, if he felt even a fraction of what I had felt reading his message. Perhaps not. Entitlement dulls empathie. The calls would have escalated quickly. From irritation to confusion, from confusion to alarm. Texts sent with increasing urgency, each one more revealing than the last. When the messages failed to send, when even the illusion of contact collapsed, the panic would have become undeniable. Chloe would have pressed him for answers. Accusations would have flown. Fear has a way of sharpening blame. And through it all, one truth would have slowly emerged. There was no safety net anymore. While their world began to shake, mine grew quieter. I tended to the garden, cooked simple meals, and slept without interruption. The absence of constant anticipation, the expectation that I would be called only when something was needed, was liberating. Silence, I discovered, could be restorative when it was chosen. I wasn't ignoring them out of cruelty. I was honoring their request. Space, after all, was what they wanted. Days passed, then a week. I knew the next phase would arrive soon. Entitlement resists surrender. It scrambles. It searches for leverage. Chloe would have begun liquidating what she could: handbags, jewelry, the visible symbols of a life she believed permanent. Leo, faced with balances he didn't understand and obligations he'd never managed, would have realized for the first time that comfort without competence is fragile. Very fragile. The eviction notice would have been the real blow, not because of the paper itself, but because of what it represented. Ownership, they would discover, was never theirs. Everything had been structured through the trust, something they had never bothered to understand because it had always worked in their favor. Seeing their address printed beside the words "Notice to Vacate" would have been sobering in a way no declined card could ever be. It's one thing to lose access to luxury. It's another to lose shelter. And then the car. The tow truck doesn't negotiate. It doesn't explain. It simply executes orders. Watching Chloe's Range Rover lifted from the street would have been a public unraveling, witnessed by neighbors who once smiled politely, unaware of how hollow that life truly was. Status evaporates quickly when it is leased rather than earned. I felt no satisfaction imagining any of it, only inevitability. I hadn't pushed them off a cliff. I had simply stepped aside and let gravity resume its work. The world was doing what I had failed to do for years, introducing my son to consequence. That night, I sat in my study and read until my eyes grew tired. The phone remained silent on the desk. I knew the storm of calls was coming, that desperation would eventually replace arrogance. But for the first time, I understood something essential. Silence was not abandonment. It was boundary. And boundary, I was learning, is sometimes the purest form of love. The calls began the way I expected them to, cautious at first, almost polite. Unknown numbers lighting up my screen, spaced just far enough apart to suggest restraint. Leo was trying to regain control without admitting he'd lost it. I let them ring. Later, I listened to the voicemails, not out of curiosity, but documentation. Years in business had taught me that patterns reveal intent more clearly than words ever could. At first, his tone was measured, professional even, as if he were speaking to a colleague who had misplaced a file. He spoke of errors and miscommunications, of banks and automated systems that must have malfunctioned. He never apologized. He never mentioned the text. Not once did he ask how I was. He assumed, still, that the issue was mechanical, not personal. That assumption alone told me everything I needed to know. Then the calls grew closer together. The pauses disappeared. His voice changed. Irritation crept in, followed quickly by accusation. He wanted answers now. He wanted access restored. He wanted his life back. Chloe's influence was unmistakable in the background. Sharp whispers, sudden bursts of anger, the sound of someone who had never learned how to be powerless. I imagined them pacing their apartment, still filled with expensive furniture but rapidly losing its meaning. A beautiful cage feels less impressive once you realize the door is locked from the outside. By the third day, desperation arrived. The tone shifted again, this time dramatically. Anger gave way to concern, manufactured, transparent concern. He left messages asking if I was okay, if I was feeling isolated, if I needed help. It was almost impressive how quickly affection could be assembled when survival demanded it. Chloe left messages too. Her voice was soft, trembling, practiced. She spoke of family, of misunderstandings, of how much they loved me. She cried on cue. I recognized the performance for what it was because I had financed it for years. The final messages came late at night. Those were the only ones that sounded honest. Leo's voice was hoarse, stripped of entitlement and bravado. He apologized, then truly, I think, not because he understood what he had done, but because the consequences had finally reached a level he couldn't ignore. He promised change, work, humility, anything. Chloe cried openly in the background, no longer trying to shape the narrative. Fear had replaced calculation. I listened to those messages once. Then I archived them. A month passed. For me, it was a season of quiet recalibration. I reconnected with old habits I had abandoned, morning walks without urgency, evenings spent reading rather than waiting. The house felt lighter, less like a stage set for a family that no longer performed there. David updated me only when legally necessary. The trust amendments were complete. Notifications had been sent. Everything was in motion. For them, the month was a slow dismantling. Their temporary solutions ran out quickly. The sale of luxury items barely covered essentials. Friends who had enjoyed their hospitality became scarce once favors were needed instead of offered. That is the unspoken truth of status. It attracts applause, not loyalty. When the lights go out, the audience leaves. The eviction process moved forward with bureaucratic efficiency. Dates, notices, deadlines. Each one a reminder that time does not negotiate. Chloe, faced with the reality of losing her home, panicked. Leo, cornered by obligations he had never learned to manage, began to crack. The man I had protected from discomfort his entire life was now drowning in it. And then, inevitably, they decided to confront the source. David called me the morning they started driving toward my house. He didn't ask what I wanted to do. He already knew. I thanked him and returned to the garden, putting on my headphones, selecting Bach orderly, precise, indifferent to human chaos. Music, I've learned, is an excellent shield. When they arrived at the gate, I did not look up at first. I heard nothing, but I felt their presence like pressure against glass. I continued pruning, inspecting leaves, making clean cuts. Their shouting was muffled, reduced to vibration rather than sound. It felt appropriate. For years, I had listened too closely to their noise. Now, they were the ones unheard. I saw them eventually through the hedge, Leo frantic, Chloe oscillating between rage and pleading. They looked smaller than I remembered. Desperation has a way of shrinking people. I did not wave. I did not acknowledge them. My peace was not something I was willing to trade for theatrics. When security arrived and escorted them away, I felt no victory, only closure. I had not argued. I had not justified myself. I had simply enforced a boundary they never believed I would. That night, I slept with the windows open. The air was cool. The house was silent, and for the first time in decades, the silence felt earned. What followed their failed confrontation was not dramatic. There were no public scenes, no explosive arguments, no desperate last stands at my doorstep. Instead, there was something far more devastating for people like Leo and Chloe: finality. Silence, when it is enforced by law rather than emotion, has a weight that cannot be argued with. It does not respond to tears. It does not soften with time. It simply exists, immovable and absolute. The email from David arrived 2 days later. Short, precise, professional. An invitation to meet at his office regarding the future of the Thorne Family Trust. I knew exactly how they would read it. Not as a summons, not as a reckoning, but as hope. People who have never been told no always mistake structure for negotiation. They would assume the chaos had finally frightened me into compromise. They would believe their apologies had worked. They would arrive ready to reclaim what they thought was theirs. I arrived early. David and I reviewed the documents one last time in his private office. No hesitation, no amendments. Everything had already been decided weeks earlier. The meeting was not for debate, only for disclosure. The trust had been restructured, beneficiaries removed, directives reassigned. What remained was execution. David asked me once, calmly, whether I was certain. I didn't answer immediately. I didn't need to. Certainty, I've learned, does not rush. It waits until doubt has exhausted itself. When I nodded, it was not out of anger. It was out of alignment. They arrived exactly on time. Leo looked thinner, not older, smaller. His suit was expensive, but it no longer fit him the way confidence once had. Chloe followed closely, her expression carefully arranged into something meant to resemble humility. They sat across from me at the long conference table. The distance between us measured not in feet, but in consequence. I studied them quietly. They avoided my eyes at first. When Leo finally spoke, his voice was careful, almost rehearsed. He apologized. He spoke of misunderstandings, stress, emotional overload. He spoke of love. He spoke of family. He spoke of change. Chloe nodded along, tears forming precisely when they were meant to. It was an impressive performance, polished, practiced, and entirely hollow. They apologized for how the situation had spiraled, not for the choices that started it. They wanted relief, not responsibility. I let him finish. Then I slid the folder across the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I simply told him to read. The room grew very quiet as pages turned, as eyes scanned familiar language now rearranged into something unrecognizable. I watched realization dawn slowly, painfully. First confusion, then disbelief, then panic. Chloe reached for his arm. Leo's breathing changed, faster, shallower. I explained what they were seeing in simple terms. No allowances, no guarantees, no assets, no future claims. The trust had been reassigned, not to another relative, not to another heir, but to a cause, a scholarship, education, opportunity. Everything they had been handed without effort would now be earned by strangers with potential. When I told Leo which university would benefit most, he finally looked at me. Really looked. That was the moment the last illusion broke. It wasn't just about money. It was about meaning. I had taken his greatest failure and turned it into someone else's future. Not out of cruelty, but out of balance. Chloe asked where they would go. I told her that was no longer my concern. They left without shouting, without pleading. Defeat does that to people. It strips away theatrics and leaves only truth behind. When the door closed, I felt no triumph, only release. Some weeks later, I attended the first scholarship ceremony. I stood in a modest auditorium filled with families who understood the value of opportunity because they had lived without it. I spoke briefly about work, about dignity, about responsibility. I didn't mention my son. I didn't need to. Legacy, I realized, is not blood. It is impact. That evening, I returned home and sat in the garden as the sun disappeared behind the trees. My phone buzzed once. A single message. One word. Dad? I didn't respond. Not yet. Time did what confrontation never could. It settled everything. Weeks turned into months, and the sharp edges of that season softened into something quieter, more reflective. I did not track Leo's life closely, but fragments reached me anyway, the way truth always does. Not through gossip, not through accusation, but through simple facts that required no interpretation. The penthouse was gone. The last car followed it. Their names, once whispered with admiration in certain circles, slowly lost relevance. Influence without substance does not age well. I learned that Leo had taken a job, not a symbolic position arranged through connections, but real work-scheduled hours, oversight, accountability, logistics, I believe, clipboards, deadlines, consequences, the kind of environment where effort is visible and excuses are not currency. Chloe found work too, managing inventory at a small boutique, folding clothes, smiling at customers, earning by the hour. Their lives had not ended. They had narrowed, and in that narrowing, something essential was happening. Struggle, when it arrives honestly, does not destroy character. It reveals it. I wondered sometimes who Leo was becoming in that process. Not the son I raised through comfort and avoidance, but the man forged by necessity. I imagined him coming home tired, hands sore, mind occupied with problems that money could not erase. I imagined the arguments, the resentment, the quiet recalibrations. When entitlement is stripped away, what remains is either resentment or resilience. Only time would decide which one he chose. As for me, the transformation was subtler but no less profound. I no longer measured my worth by my usefulness to others. I spent mornings in the garden, afternoons reading or building small things in my workshop, evenings cooking meals I actually sat down to enjoy. Friends I had neglected resurfaced, relationships that had once been postponed in favor of obligation. The world did not collapse because I stopped financing it. It adjusted. The scholarship flourished. Letters arrived, handwritten, careful, grateful. Students who would never have known my name now carried it into futures built on effort rather than entitlement. I attended ceremonies not as a benefactor seeking recognition, but as a witness. Watching someone earn what my son had once dismissed was not painful. It was grounding. It reminded me why I built anything at all. Occasionally, my phone would light up with a message from an unfamiliar number. Short, respectful, never demanding. Leo had learned something at last, how to knock instead of assuming the door was always open. I read every message. I didn't respond to all of them. Silence, when used correctly, teaches patience. And patience, I believed, was a lesson he still needed. One evening, months after that final meeting, I sat outside as dusk settled over the lawn. The house felt different now, not emptier, but truer. I thought of Anna then, more clearly than I had in years. I imagined what she might have said. She would not have scolded me. She would have understood. She had always known that love without limits becomes something else entirely. I realized then that I had not lost my son. I had released him. Whatever relationship we might rebuild would not be purchased. It would not be owed. It would be chosen. And if that day never came, I would still be at peace, because I had finally stopped confusing sacrifice with love. I leaned back and listened to the evening sounds. The wind through leaves, the distant call of a bird settling in for the night. The silence around me was no longer heavy. It was earned. It was honest. And for the first time in a very long life, it felt like freedom. The final understanding did not arrive in a dramatic moment. There was no single realization that struck like lightning. No sudden emotional release that demanded tears or celebration. Instead, it unfolded quietly, the way dawn does slowly, inevitably, without asking for permission. I was sitting in the garden one morning, the air cool and clean, when it occurred to me that I no longer felt the need to justify myself. Not to friends, not to family, not even to the version of myself that once believed love had to be proven through endless giving. That version of me had lived for decades under a simple rule. If I provided enough, if I absorbed enough disappointment without protest, eventually appreciation would arrive. But appreciation does not grow in soil saturated with entitlement. It withers there. What grows instead is expectation heavy, demanding, and endlessly dissatisfied. I had mistaken endurance for virtue. What I learned, far too late but not too late to matter, was that boundaries are not punishments. They are definitions. They tell people where you end and where they begin. I thought about Leo often, but not with bitterness. I wondered how he navigated his new life, how it felt to wake up knowing that effort, not inheritance, would determine the outcome of his day. I imagined him learning the rhythm of responsibility, showing up on time, answering to someone else, carrying the quiet weight of expectations that could not be escaped with a phone call. I imagined the frustration, the resentment, and eventually, perhaps, the pride. Not the borrowed kind, but the earned kind. The kind that settles into your bones and changes how you stand in the world. Chloe, too, crossed my mind from time to time. I wondered what it was like for her to exist without an audience, without applause, to fold clothes instead of curating appearances, to earn instead of display. I did not wish her harm. I wished her clarity. The kind that only arrives when illusion collapses and you are left alone with who you truly are. The scholarship continued to grow, quietly doing what money should always do, when guided properly, create opportunity rather than dependency. Watching students cross stages, hearing their plans spoken with humility and hunger, I felt something I had not felt in years. Pride without anxiety, giving without fear, legacy without control. I had finally separated love from leverage. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in muted gold, my phone vibrated beside me. I turned it over and read the message slowly. Just one word. One question. Dad? No demands. No expectations. No entitlement. I smiled, not because I felt victorious, and not because I felt absolved, but because the choice was finally mine. Real choice. The kind that exists only when power is balanced and respect has a chance to breathe. I didn't reply immediately. I didn't need to. Some things are better answered when they are no longer urgent. I set the phone down and leaned back, listening to the evening settle around me. The house behind me stood solid and quiet. The garden breathed. The world felt unhurried. Whatever came next, reconnection or continued distance, it would be built on something honest, something earned. For the first time in many years, I wasn't afraid of the future. I wasn't clinging to the past. I had finally learned that love does not mean endless access, and family does not mean endless forgiveness without change. Sometimes the strongest act of care is stepping back and letting life teach the lessons you could not. In giving my son the space he demanded, I had given us both something far more valuable than money. I had given us the chance for respect.